the coldest night anyone in Blackwater Valley could remember, two thin lines of smoke rose into the frozen Montana sky. Not one, two. And that was how people knew something strange was happening at the end of Hartwell Road. Northern Montana, February 1948. The valley lay buried under 3 feet of snow. The wind had shaped the drifts into hard frozen waves that glittered under a pale gray dawn. It was 22 degrees below zero. The kind of cold that makes trees crack in the night and turns every breath into a cloud of frost. Most homes in the valley were struggling to survive it, but at the far end of the valley stood a curved steel building that many people once laughed at. A Quonset hut made from old military steel panels left over after the war. People in town said those huts were fine for storing tractors, but living in one during a Montana winter was foolish. Steel froze. Steel stole warmth. Steel turned houses into ice boxes. And yet that morning, 2 steady columns of smoke rose from the roof of that hut, as calmly as if the wind had no power over them. Harold Brennan pulled his horse to a stop on the snow-packed road and stared at the strange sight. Harold was 53 years old and had lived his entire life in the valley. He had built his timber house with thick logs and stone fireplaces. Even so, the cold had crept through every wall that winter. His wife had coughed through the night. His grandchildren slept, wrapped in coats beneath heavy blankets. In just 5 days, he had burned half of his winter wood supply. But here, standing alone on a wide stretch of frozen prairie, the little steel hut seemed untouched by the suffering around it. The 2 thin lines of smoke rose steady and quiet into the sky. Inside that hut lived a widow named Eleanor Hartwell and her 3 children. Most people in the valley had believed she would never survive her first winter. Harold himself had warned her. Now he sat there in his saddle watching the smoke rise and felt something colder than the wind move through his chest. Doubt. To understand how those 2 chimneys came to be, one must return to a warm spring morning 9 months earlier. A morning when a battered Ford pickup truck rattled slowly down the dirt road into Blackwater Valley. May 1947. Dust followed the truck like a long brown ribbon across the prairie. The engine coughed and rattled as it climbed the final hill, overlooking a wide, empty stretch of land beside a narrow creek. Behind the wheel sat Eleanor Hartwell. She was 31 years old, with tired eyes and hands rough from long months of hard work. For over a year, she had washed laundry and scrubbed floors in town just to keep food on the table for her children. Beside her sat her daughter Grace, 9 years old and already carrying the quiet seriousness of someone much older. Next to Grace sat Samuel, 7 years old, watching the open land with wide, curious eyes. Little Lily, only 5, slept softly against her brother's shoulder as the truck rolled to a stop. For a long moment, none of them spoke. There was nothing around them except grass, sky, and the soft sound of water moving through the creek. Samuel leaned forward and looked through the dusty windshield. "Where's the house?" he asked. Eleanor stepped out of the truck and walked slowly toward the back. She lowered the tailgate and looked at the heavy stack of curved steel panels tied down with rope. 800 pieces of metal. A Quonset hut kit she had purchased from a military surplus yard for $175. It was the only building she could afford. Her husband, Thomas Hartwell, had worked in the Butte copper mines the year before. One cold morning, the tunnel collapsed without warning. 3 miners never came back out. A telegram had arrived 2 days later. Just a few lines of words. No goodbye, no explanation, only loss. For many nights, Eleanor cried after her children had fallen asleep. But when the sun rose each morning, she went to work. A wooden house would cost $2,000 in lumber alone. She had less than $900 to her name. The steel hut was her only chance to build something before winter returned. Samuel walked beside her and looked at the tall pile of metal. "So this is our house?" he asked quietly. Eleanor nodded. "We are going to build it," she said, "together." She had just begun untying the ropes when the distant sound of hoofbeats carried across the field. A rider approached slowly from the direction of the valley road. Harold Brennan pulled his horse to a stop beside the truck and studied the pile of steel with a deep frown. "That thing is a coffin," he said, pointing toward the curved panels. Eleanor looked up at him calmly. "Steel freezes in winter," he continued. "You will burn wood day and night and still feel the cold." Eleanor wiped dust from her hands. "What would you have me do?" she asked. Harold shifted in his saddle. "You could sell the land," he said. "Move into town. Families there would help with the children." For a moment, the wind moved quietly across the open grass. Then Eleanor straightened her shoulders. "My children stay with me," she said in a steady voice. "All of them." Harold studied her for a long moment, then turned his horse and rode away across the field. The next morning, construction began. Eleanor had never built more than a small chicken coop in her life, but she knew how to read instructions. She knew how to measure carefully and learn from mistakes. She laid old railroad ties across the ground to form a simple foundation because concrete cost more money than she could spare. She bought discounted pine boards from a lumber yard in town and built a strong wooden floor. The hardest work was raising the curved steel ribs that formed the frame of the hut. Each one was heavy and awkward to lift alone, so Eleanor built a simple pulley using 2 old wagon wheels and a length of rope. It took her 3 full days to raise the first steel arch into place, but she did not stop. Grace passed her bolts and washers from a small wooden box. Samuel counted each piece carefully before handing it to her. Little Lily walked around the grass collecting every dropped nail she could find, like small pieces of treasure. At sunset one evening, Eleanor looked down at her tired children and smiled. "We are a team," she said, "and our team does not quit." Quote, "By the middle of August, the hut finally stood complete, 20 feet wide, 48 feet long, a shining silver half-circle rising from the prairie grass. Neighbors drove past, slowly to stare. Some shook their heads. Others whispered quietly to one another. Winter came faster than Eleanor expected. And when the first cold winds of November arrived, she began to learn a hard truth about steel homes on the Montana plains. The first cold winds of November arrived earlier than anyone expected that year. The prairie grass turned stiff and gray, and the creek beside Eleanor's land began to freeze along the edges. Inside the Quonset hut, Eleanor lit the small potbelly stove she had placed in the center of the floor. At first it seemed to work well enough. The iron stove glowed softly, and the children gathered around it with their hands stretched toward the warmth. Grace read a small book beside the firelight. Samuel sat cross-legged, carving a tiny wooden horse with a pocket knife he had found in the truck. Lily leaned against her mother's shoulder and hummed a quiet song. Near the stove it felt warm and safe, but 15 feet away the air felt very different. Cold gathered at the far ends of the hut like invisible water filling 2 deep wells. When Eleanor walked to the edge of the room, her breath turned white in front of her face. One morning she placed a bucket of water near the back wall before going to bed. When she woke before sunrise, the water inside the bucket had frozen solid. The curved steel walls held the night's cold, like a memory that refused to leave. The children did not complain, but Eleanor saw the way Grace pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders during breakfast. She saw Samuel blow warm air into his hands before picking up his spoon, and Lily began sleeping with her socks on. Eleanor kept the fire burning day and night. Every 2 hours she woke in the darkness to add another piece of wood to the stove. Sometimes the wind outside howled across the prairie so loudly that the steel walls of the hut creaked like an old ship. Many nights she lay awake beside the stove with her children sleeping around her. But Eleanor Hartwell did not waste much time worrying. She watched. She paid attention. The more she studied the hut, the more she began to notice small things that others might have ignored. Warm air rose quickly from the stove and traveled up along the curved metal ceiling. It gathered near the center of the arch above their heads, but halfway down the length of the hut, That warmth seemed to disappear. The ends of the building stayed cold no matter how much wood she burned. The warm air simply drifted upward and stopped moving, and the cold air settled along the floor like a quiet lake. One night, Eleanor stood alone in the center of the hut, holding a small lantern. She lifted the lantern high and watched the flame move slightly as the air shifted around it. The heat was rising, but it was not returning. She sat down beside the stove and asked herself a different question. Not how do I survive this winter, but why is this happening? Days passed. Snow began falling across the valley in long, slow waves. Some mornings the wind buried half the hut beneath drifts of powdery white snow. And then, early one afternoon, a wagon appeared on the road beside the creek. The driver was an old traveling tinker named Amos Walker. Amos was a thin man with sharp eyes and a beard the color of snow. His wagon carried tools, scrap metal, and strange little devices he sold from town to town. He stopped when he saw the curved steel hut standing alone on the prairie. Curiosity pulled him down from his seat. Eleanor welcomed him inside to warm himself by the stove. Amos walked slowly through the hut with his hands folded behind his back. He studied the ceiling, the walls, and the stove in the center. After a long moment, he nodded thoughtfully. "You are losing heat to the ends," he said. Eleanor looked up from the small kettle she was warming. "What do you mean?" Quote, Amos pointed toward the far wall. "The warm air rises and gathers above your head," he explained, "but nothing pushes it back down again. The cold air stays trapped along the floor." Eleanor thought quietly for a moment. "What would fix it?" she asked. Amos scratched his beard. "I once saw a rancher solve it with 2 stoves," he said, "one at each end of the building." Samuel looked up quickly from the floor. "2 stoves?" he asked. Amos nodded. "2 small fires instead of 1 big one," he said. "The warm air rises from both sides and meets in the middle." Eleanor considered the idea carefully. Everyone in the valley had told her the opposite. They said using 2 stoves would burn twice as much wood. But Eleanor had already learned that most people in the valley were guessing. They had never lived inside a steel hut through a Montana winter. Amos finished his tea and climbed back onto his wagon. Before leaving, he looked at Eleanor once more. "Sometimes the answer is simple," he said, "but simple answers still require courage." The wagon rattled away across the frozen road. For the next few days, Eleanor said nothing to anyone, but she began looking carefully around the valley for a second stove. Near the edge of town, she found one sitting behind a blacksmith's shed. It was cracked along one side and covered in rust. The blacksmith wanted $15 for it. Eleanor counted the money slowly from the small cloth purse she carried in her coat. It was nearly all she had left for the month. Still, she handed it over. The next morning, she climbed onto the roof of the Quonset hut with a hammer and saw. When Harold Brennan rode past on horseback that afternoon, he stopped again in the road. Eleanor was standing high on the curved roof, cutting a second hole through the steel panels. "What in the world are you doing?" Harold called up. Eleanor looked down at him calmly. "Adding another chimney," she answered. Harold stared at her as if she had completely lost her mind. "You will burn through your wood pile before Christmas," he said. "2 stoves will eat twice the fuel." Eleanor wiped sweat from her forehead and smiled slightly. "Maybe," she said. "Or maybe I finally learned something." That night, as snow drifted quietly across the prairie, 2 small fires burned inside the steel hut for the very first time, one at each end. Eleanor sat quietly in the center of the room and waited. She did not speak. She simply watched the air above her head begin to move. A full-body, symmetrical, medium-long shot captures a middle-aged woman standing centered in a dimly lit, rustic, circular room that appears to be the interior of a historical dwelling, possibly a clan house or period hut. The woman, who appears to be in her 40s or early 50s, has fair skin and medium blonde hair tied back neatly, giving her a tidy, if stern, appearance. She is wearing a historically inspired ensemble consisting of a long-sleeved, ankle-length, brown or dark taupe dress made of a sturdy material, possibly wool or linen. Over the dress, she wears a light cream or off-white apron that extends to just above her ankles. Her hands are clasped neatly in front of her, resting on the apron. She is looking directly at the camera with a neutral expression. The interior of the dwelling is constructed primarily of natural materials. The walls are made of rough-hewn, stacked stones, creating a sturdy, rustic texture. The roof is conical and supported by visible, dark-stained wooden rafters that converge toward a central, circular skylight or opening at the apex, through which a bright column of natural light shines down and bathes the woman in a soft, ethereal glow. The floor is made of wide, dark wooden planks. The room is sparsely furnished but functional, suggesting a communal living space. 4 wooden bed frames are visible, 2 on the left and 2 on the right, arranged symmetrically along the curvature of the room. The beds are covered primarily with thick, textured animal pelts or furs, providing warm bedding. Some beds also have rough blankets or throws. Flanking the woman on both the far left and far right are open stone fireplaces, where small, warm fires are visibly burning, casting orange light and shadows across the stone walls. Above the beds and surrounding the walls are simple wooden shelves built into the stone structure. These shelves hold various rustic items, mainly dark metal pots, pans, and bowls, suggesting this space also functions as a kitchen or storage area. The items are stacked or hung on pegs, emphasizing the utilitarian nature of the room. The lighting is dramatic, with the bright central light from the roof contrasting sharply with the warm, firelight glow and the general darkness of the stone and wood interior, creating a historical and atmospheric mood. The letter arrived on a quiet afternoon in early April. Eleanor Hartwell was stacking firewood beside the shed when Grace ran down the path from the road holding a white envelope. "Mama, the post-rider brought this," she said. Eleanor wiped her hands on her apron and took the envelope slowly. The paper felt stiff and official between her fingers. She opened it carefully and read the words once. Then she read them again. The letter came from the county bank. It stated that an inspection would be conducted on her property within the week. Complaints had been filed about unsafe living conditions for her children. If the claim failed inspection, her right to the land could be reconsidered. Eleanor folded the letter and slipped it into her pocket. Her hands did not shake, but she understood exactly what it meant. Someone in the valley wanted her land, and she knew which property bordered her creek. Harold Brennan's pasture stretched along the western edge of her claim. The small creek that ran through Eleanor's land provided the best water in the valley. Water meant healthy cattle. Water meant power. Water meant control. She did not accuse anyone. She did not waste time with anger. Instead, Eleanor prepared. Over the next 3 days, she cleaned every inch of the Quonset hut. The wooden floor was scrubbed until it shone in the sunlight. The children's beds were neatly arranged against the curved walls. Food supplies were stacked carefully along the shelves. Jars of beans, sacks of flour, and dried meat filled the small pantry she had built beside the stove. Grace helped wash blankets in the creek. Samuel carried water buckets back and forth across the yard. Lily followed behind them with a rag, determined to polish anything within reach. At night, Eleanor reviewed the careful notes inside her worn notebook. Temperatures, wood usage, weather conditions. Every page showed the same thing. The hut worked. On the morning of April 1st, 3 riders appeared on the road leading toward the house. A bank manager in a dark coat, the county sheriff, and a woman from the state child welfare office. Eleanor greeted them at the door with calm eyes and steady hands. "Please come in," she said. The woman stepped inside first. She walked slowly through the hut without speaking. Her eyes studied the beds, the shelves of food, the water barrels beside the wall. Then she stopped between the 2 stoves. "Why 2?" she asked. Eleanor explained the system the same way she had explained it to Walter. No pride filled her voice. No apology either, just the truth. The warm air meets above the ceiling and comes back down, she said. It keeps the whole hut the same temperature. The woman nodded slightly. Do you have records? Quote. Eleanor handed her the notebook. The woman read silently for several minutes, while the sheriff leaned against the wall and the bank manager shifted nervously beside the door. Finally, the woman closed the notebook. This home is clean, she said. It is warm. The children are healthy. The bank manager opened his mouth as if to protest, but the woman raised her hand gently. I evaluate facts, she said, not gossip. The inspection ended there. The riders left without another word. When the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance, Eleanor sat down slowly at the small wooden table. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to breathe deeply, but the valley had not finished testing her yet. By late November, the radio in town began warning about a powerful Arctic air mass moving south from Canada. Temperatures were expected to drop below 20 degrees below zero, possibly colder. Eleanor gathered her children around the table that evening. It will be hard, she said softly, but we are ready. Grace nodded with quiet confidence. Samuel tightened his jaw like a small soldier preparing for battle. Lily climbed into her mother's lap and wrapped her arms around Eleanor's neck. The cold arrived 2 days later, minus 22 degrees, and it stayed that way for 5 straight days. Across Blackwater Valley, families burned wood without rest. Fires roared inside fireplaces from morning until midnight. Ice formed along the inside of windows. Children slept fully dressed beneath blankets. Some homes ran dangerously low on firewood before the storm had even reached its worst. At the Brennan house, the fireplace burned day and night. Harold stacked logs until his arms ached, yet the cold still crept through the thick timber walls. Martha Brennan's cough grew deeper with every passing night. But at the end of Hartwell Road, 2 steady columns of smoke rose calmly into the frozen sky. Inside the Quonset hut, the 2 stoves burned low and patient. Not roaring, not desperate, balanced. Warm air rose from both ends of the hut and met along the curved ceiling before drifting gently back down toward the floor. The thermometer hanging beside Eleanor's bed read 60 degrees. Samuel woke one night and crawled quietly across the wooden floor beside his mother. "Why aren't you sleeping?" he whispered. Eleanor watched the flames dancing inside the nearest stove. "I'm listening to the fire," she answered. Samuel sat beside her and looked at the 2 glowing stoves. "They talk to each other," he said softly. "Like playing catch." Eleanor smiled in the dim firelight. "Yes," she said, "they do." By the 5th morning, the valley was exhausted. Wood piles had nearly vanished. Tempers had grown thin. But Eleanor's woodshed still held nearly half its stack. And when the brutal cold finally began to break, someone rode down Hartwell Road with a notebook and a very serious question. How had she done it? The rider who came down Hartwell Road that morning was Walter Kincaid. The valley's metalworker had not stopped thinking about Eleanor's Quonset hut since the day he first stepped inside it. During the brutal cold that had just passed, he had watched neighbors struggle to keep their homes warm. And every morning, no matter how strong the wind blew, he saw the same quiet sight rising into the sky. 2 thin lines of smoke. He dismounted beside Eleanor's gate and walked toward the hut carrying a measuring tape, a thermometer, and a small notebook. Eleanor greeted him with a calm nod. Walter stepped inside and stood quietly for a moment. The hut felt warm, not the heavy heat of a roaring fire, but the steady comfort of a room where warmth had settled naturally into every corner. He checked the thermometer near the door, 60 degrees. Then he walked slowly to the far end of the hut and checked again. 60. Walter frowned in quiet amazement. He stepped outside and checked the outside air temperature with his pocket thermometer. 22 degrees below zero. He returned inside and looked at Eleanor. 38 degrees warmer than most houses in the valley this week, he said. And you used less wood. Eleanor looked toward the far wall where her children were playing on the wooden floor. I just paid attention, she said. Walter stood in the center of the hut for a long time, thinking carefully. Finally, he opened his notebook and began drawing simple diagrams of the building. He measured the distance between the two stoves. He studied the height of the chimneys above the roof. He wrote down how the warm air moved along the curved ceiling and returned to the floor. By the time he finished, 12 pages of careful notes filled his notebook. "You solved something important," Walter said quietly. Eleanor shook her head. "I only wanted my children warm." But the valley had already begun to notice. Within days, people started arriving at Hartwell Road. Some came on horseback. Some drove wagons across the frozen fields. Some walked miles through snow just to knock on Eleanor's door. All of them asked the same question: how did you do it? Eleanor never charged them money. She simply showed them. She pointed to the two stoves placed at opposite ends of the hut. She explained the height of the chimneys and how the warm air moved along the curved steel ceiling before returning to the floor. She showed them the beds of stones beneath each stove that held warmth long after the fire burned low. She even drew simple sketches on scrap paper so they could remember. Because Eleanor believed something simple: survival was not meant to be hoarded. It was meant to be shared. But while her reputation began spreading across the valley, tension grew quietly inside the Brennan household. Martha Brennan had heard enough whispers from neighbors to understand the truth. She knew her husband had filed the complaints that nearly cost Eleanor her land, and the silence between them became heavier than the winter snow. One evening, Martha stood in the doorway of Harold's study while he stared at the dying fire inside the stone fireplace. "You know what you have to do," she said softly. Harold did not answer right away. Finally, he sighed. "I wanted that land," he admitted. "The creek would make my pasture stronger." Martha crossed her arms. "And what would that make you?" she asked. Harold had no answer. The next afternoon, he saddled his horse and rode slowly down Hartwell Road. The snow had begun melting beneath the spring sun. Mud clung to his boots when he stepped off the horse and walked toward the hut. Eleanor opened the door before he could knock. She stood calmly in the doorway, waiting. Harold removed his hat. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology." Eleanor studied his face. "For the bank letter," she said. "For the complaints." Harold lowered his eyes. "I was wrong," he admitted. "Thomas was my friend. When he died, I should have helped you. Instead, I looked for advantage." The wind moved softly across the prairie grass around them. Eleanor spoke after a long moment. "I do not have time for revenge," she said. "I have children to raise." Harold swallowed. "Can you forgive me?" Quote. Eleanor shook her head slightly. "Not yet," she said, "but we can start over as neighbors." Harold nodded slowly. "Neighbors who do not scheme," she added. "Neighbors who help when help is needed." He extended his hand. Eleanor took it. The handshake was not warm, but it was honest. From that day forward, something changed in Blackwater Valley. Walter Kincaid finished his drawings that summer. 12 careful pages explaining airflow, chimney height, stove placement, and heat retention from stone. He wrote Eleanor Hartwell's name at the top. She asked him not to. He refused. "The idea is yours," he said. Copies of his drawings spread across Montana. Farmers, builders, and engineers began studying the simple system. Men who once laughed started installing second stoves. Women who once whispered began asking questions. The next winter, new chimneys appeared across the valley, 2 at a time. One of the first was another widow named Ruth Ashford, who lived 5 miles east. Eleanor helped her install the system herself. When Ruth tried to pay her, Eleanor pushed the money gently back into her hand. "We survived together," she said. Or not at all. 5 years later, Eleanor's land claim was officially hers. The small steel hut still stood proudly beside the creek. And one evening, her son Samuel, now a grown young man, helped her build a simple wooden porch at the front of the hut. It was not the large wooden house her husband Thomas once dreamed of, but it was strong, and it was theirs. Years later, Samuel would tell the story to his own children, about the winter when the valley nearly froze, About the steel hut everyone called a coffin, about the widow who refused to give up her land or her children, and about the 2 quiet columns of smoke that proved everyone else wrong. Because sometimes strength does not look loud. Sometimes it looks like a woman standing on a steel roof cutting a second hole for a chimney, while the whole valley shakes its head. Sometimes it looks like careful notes in a worn notebook. Sometimes it looks like staying awake through the night so your children never feel the cold. Eleanor Hartwell never had a degree. She had no money and no powerful friends. But she had something stronger. 3 children, a pile of steel, and the courage to try something different when everyone else said it would fail. 2 small fires, 2 thin columns of smoke, and a warm home that refused to surrender to the cold. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who believes strength can grow from the most unexpected places.